This is the incredible story of a German ace and his 9 American brothers. At 27,000 feet, the world outside the cockpit of a B-17 was no longer sky and cloud. It was a shattered dome of plexiglass, a spray of snow-like insulation, and a steady metallic smell of fuel and blood. Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown fought the controls with hands gone numb from cold and shock. The right engines were dead. The rudder trembled. One of his waist gunners was already motionless. The oxygen masks had torn loose. The electric lights were dark. Below them, the industrial sprawl of Bremen glowed and burned with anti-aircraft fire. Around them, enemy fighters were hungry. This mission began like countless others in the winter of 1943. Briefing rooms, slick maps, the cramped confidence of young crews told to fly into what airmen called the Purple Heart Corner, the hostile heart of German defenses, where flak and fighters waited like wolves. The target that day was a fighter plane factory near Bremen, a place that mattered to both sides. Men in the 379th Bombardment Group climbed into their flying fortresses and trusted metal, training, and luck to carry them home. Ye Old Pub was a B-17 among many. Its crew was young, the majority barely out of their teens or in their early 20s, hauling the burden of war in a tin tube that bucked and burned. Crew positions are a shorthand for humanity: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, names that map to faces and voices and small habits. These men had families somewhere in the United States who would have assumed before dawn that their sons were doing what soldiers do: fly, fight, and come back. Just after noon on December 20th, 1943, Ye Old Pub was hit. Flak tore through her tail and waist. Fighters found the seam where life separated from death. The top turret was ripped open like a can. The tail was a ragged wound. Oxygen lines were severed. The instruments that helped keep a bomber alive blinked and went out. One man, a tail gunner, was killed outright. Others were wounded, hands shredded by metal, faces frosted by an unmerciful Arctic air at altitude. The bomber, once a solid shape of purpose, now drifted like a broken insect. They fell. Not steadily, no, falling in a way that felt like surrender. The nose tucked, the engines howled, the fragile airframe complained. Charlie Brown, young and trained, counted his options as averages and odds. He feathered the surviving props, tried to keep altitude, tried to manage the failing hydraulics and the ice. He knew more brutally than the men on the ground that a crippled B-17 was a dead thing in German skies. In moments like these, skill shrinks to a single thing: keep breathing, keep moving, keep the men alive. Above them, slicing through the cold, a German fighter pilot closed in. He had a passport of victories, kills tallied and recorded, his name known in the lists of the Luftwaffe as a man who had survived and excelled. Franz Stigler was not a fanatic. He was a professional who had learned war as men learn a craft, by repetition and losses. He had seen comrades die. He had felt the grief that comes from watching young men vanish and thinking queasily, "It could have been me." On that December day, Stigler lined his Messerschmitt Bf-109 up behind the smoking bomber. By conventional measures, he had choices that promised medal and promotion: a clean, celebrated shot, a tally that would further his reputation and possibly secure honors like the Knight's Cross. Instead, something moved in him that was not part of calculation. The fighters had the advantage. They were built to kill. But as Stigler closed, as the bomber's wounds and the silhouettes of its men became clear through the gun sight, he saw things he did not expect. A frozen hand. A face that showed more shock than hate, the subtle, terrible stillness that meant a man had bled out in his turret. He saw blood on rags and the glint of broken glass over an eye. The bomber was no longer a threat. It was a dying machine with human beings strapped to it. There is a story to be told about the rules men keep even in lawless places, and about the private pledges precise people make to retain some trace of conscience. Stigler had a commanding officer, Gustav Rodel, whose code of conduct had seeped into him like damp into cloth: "Do not shoot men who cannot fight back." Whether he thought of that phrase in the instant, or whether the memory arrived as an understanding, is less important than the fact that the memory stopped him. For Stigler, trained to see a plane as a target, the sight of defenseless men transformed an order into a moral problem. He lowered his sights. To kill them would have been simple. To spare them would be complicated, risky, and, by the standards of his side, near treason. The wartime code, the work of commands and paper and doctrine, expected pilots to press advantage, especially against an enemy already disabled. A pilot who withheld fire could be accused of deliberate failure to engage. Under the regime that ruled Germany then, leniency toward the enemy could be punished harshly. Stigler did not behave as an ideologue. He behaved as a man who, in the tilt of a second, decided that honor had limits set by decency rather than orders. He approached the bomber. He closed until his shadow fell on its battered wing. He saw the men inside, white-faced and hollowed by fear. He saw their dead comrade being tossed into the slipstream. He could have strafed the crippled aircraft and sent it quicker into the North Sea. Instead, he did something that in the jargon of war was unthinkable. He flew alongside it. The image is almost unbearably quiet. Two planes in an expanse of gray, one wounded and limping, the other a predator that chooses not to strike. Stigler moved his Messerschmitt to the wing of Ye Old Pub, and for the men inside it must have felt as if the sky itself had decided to hesitate. Close formation is intimate in the air. The slipstream bites. The vibration transfers like a touch. From the bomber, pressed by wind and fear and the smell of burned fabric, a German fighter made a shape that did not kill. This was not a short mercy. It was a gamble. To stay near a crippled enemy meant being visible to German anti-aircraft batteries that practiced a grim geometry of anticipation. Guns that cued to shoot anything at the wrong altitude and direction. The pilot who refused to fire was, by virtue of his action, now conspicuous. He presented himself as a man who could be singled out for failure to engage and punished. Stigler weighed those consequences like any sane officer would. The chance of surviving the war, the welfare of his wife and family, his own name. He balanced that against the sight before him. He chose the sight. He gestured. He did not shout. There was no time for that. He pulled alongside and then, in a solitary small ritual that mocked the brutality around them, he saluted. It was not a mockery of his own cause. It was a salute to the humanity in those hollowed faces, a recognition that the men in the bomber had been soldiers, but, at that moment, were something else, vulnerable males and sons and brothers who had nowhere to hide. Inside Ye Old Pub, the men felt the presence, then looked up to see the German ace. In a moment that would become a touchstone for war stories, the kind of moment that insists on being told again and again, Charlie Brown caught the glance of a pilot who could have ended them, and instead offered what passed in the sky for mercy. Brown later described disbelief and the sudden, skeptical hope that a trick might be unfolding. He did not know whether the fighter would change course and reopen its jaws. He did not know if he could trust airmen he had been taught to hate. Trust in war is expensive and rare. The bomber kept flying. The Messerschmitt fell into step. From that instant, the single urgent problem for both men was not who would get what medal. It was where would the bomber land. Ye Old Pub was fatally wounded. It could not make the long haul home. It could not, with any certainty, reach neutral Sweden, or make the perilous crossing to the North Sea, and out over water where rescue might come from the Royal Air Force. The coastline was dozens of miles away, and the airspace between was saturated with flak and scrambling fighters. The German pilot who chose mercy could not simply escort the bomber to an airfield without drawing attention. To help was to place himself in the crosshairs of his own side. What Stigler did next was not scripted in any manual. He flew in close formation with the bomber, not as an enemy, but as a guide. He drifted up and down, blocking the view of the men below, so that German ground defenses could, by the look of it from the ground, confuse the sight and think these were friendly aircraft returning to base. Close formation has the strange effect of altering recognition. From certain angles, two planes touching in the sky look like one, and human observers on the ground have fractions of a second to decide. Those fractions, Stigler understood, could be manipulated. The crossing of hostile airspace turned into a strange, heart-stopping chess match where the pieces were metal and lives were the stakes. Stigler played a dangerous gambit: stay in the bomber's shadow, keep distance close enough to disguise them, and time the approach so that coastal defenses would hesitate. It was a tactic with small chance and large risk. Any miscalculation would expose them both. Below them, Flak tried to read their signal and failed to comprehend it. Guns sprayed the sky with iron bouquets, but bursts that would have had a clearer shot at an isolated bomber skittered and missed as the two aircraft moved together. Fighters that might have pounced were uncertain. The German ace had, by not following orders, created confusion enough to save lives. All the while, inside the shaken fuselage, men did what men always do in crisis. They attended to the more immediate tasks. The co-pilot fought the trim. Gunners strapped and aimed and tried to fathom whether strafing runs had truly ceased. Chunk by chunk, ye old pub limped toward the coast. None of the men believed what they were seeing. For Brown, the mission horizon narrowed to inches. Keep the plane in the air. Keep those 9 men, his crew, his brothers, alive. He became a technician of survival. He feathered engines, watched the altimeter and the drift, and attempted, with a pilot's sterile focus, to make fact from accident. Outside the fuselage, the enemy fighter remained. It kept formation and did not fire. It kept distance and mirrored their pace. It was a presence that reframed the entire flight. They were not the only parties paying attention. Somewhere over the North Sea, German radar and coastal stations were watching and reinterpreting. British fighters were on alert. Both sides read the sky like open text, but interpreted lines differently. The unusual pairing gave ye old pub something like camouflage, motion that confused recognition and bought minutes that convert to life. Back on the German side, the stakes for Stigler hardened. He was, if discovered, a man who had disobeyed orders. He had chosen the lives of unknown enemies over instructions. He had risked his career and possibly his life. The Luftwaffe, like every military institution in war, maintained codes that were enforced with harshness when the political winds demanded it. To act from personal moral law was to court punishment. Yet Stigler did not retreat. He kept his wings steady. He kept his formation. There is a paradox in such actions. In choosing to spare, a man makes himself conspicuous. He becomes visible not only to those he spares, but to those who would arrest, court-martial, or condemn. There is bravery in that. Not the sort displayed in publicity photos, but the quieter, more personal kind that says, in effect, I will risk consequences because something inside demands it. Miles passed. The coastline came into view as a thin, hard line. For the men of ye old pub, every mile looked like a small miracle. More distance between them and the industrial hell of Bremen, more possibility of rescue. The pilot of the Messerschmitt stayed with them, timing his positioning so that, if a German anti-aircraft battery opened up at a suspicious angle, he could maneuver to obscure the bomber's vulnerable bits. It was hand-to-hand improvisation, not doctrine. It required nerve and a kind of mechanical finesse honed by thousands of hours in the air. Inside the bomber, conversations were sparse and brittle. Injured men groaned. They passed morphine when they could. They shouted coordinates and adjustments in clipped, precise fragments. They relied on the one man who could still see fore and aft, the pilot, and on the stranger at their wing who had changed the nature of their fate. It is important not to mythologize the moment beyond what is recorded. Neither man in that sky performed a grand speech, nor did the bomber ride safely and serenely home under a protective halo. The crossing was a fragile improvisation under threat. Enemy fighters still prowled. Anti-aircraft batteries still searched the sky. Engine failures could not be fixed at altitude. The bomber was still, fundamentally, a damaged thing in need of luck. Then, something small, precise, and striking happened. As they banked and adjusted toward a path that would take them toward the sea, Stigler slipped alongside, leaned his head out of his cockpit, and gave a salute. It was a tiny, human signal, an acknowledgement that transcended uniforms and orders. For Brown, who later recounted the incident in interviews and debriefings, that salute became an emblem. In the midst of war's impersonality, two men had recognized each other's personhood. A salute is a gesture that contains contradictory meanings in war. It can be contempt. It can be respect. Here it was the latter, an admission that, for a moment, the men on both sides were not enemies, but breathing men. The German pilot had recognized the suffering before him, and in so doing reframed the nature of his own duty. There were immediate costs. Stigler had to thread the bomber through zones that were patrolled by friendly fighters who might not understand his intentions. He had to hope that no junior officer would demand an explanation that would paint him as a traitor. He had to accept that, if captured by the Allies later in some unexpected way, his motives might be easily misread. Yet he kept his wing. The men in Ye Old Pub could not know the internal calculus of the pilot at their side. They could only register the facts. A German fighter was escorting them, and he did not fire. Those facts were enough to change the tone of their fear. Hope, in that context, is a slow and brittle thing, but it grew with every mile that did not end in a flare of shrapnel. The bomber held steady. As they crossed the line between German-held airspace and the open North Sea, every pilot's training hashed itself into two words: timing and control. The coastline was an ambiguous friend. To reach it safely meant being spotted, possibly attacked, but it was also the only route that might put them within range of Allied airfields and rescue. The plan became implicitly to make it to the coast and then, if the bomber could still fly a short distance, descend and attempt to land in territory friendly to Allied aircraft. That was the plan. It was a plan thin as tissue in the face of reality. Ye Old Pub's engines coughed and puked fuel. The controls answered sluggishly. Instruments frosted. Men passed lapsed between consciousness and waking. Yet the presence at their wing turned the improbable into a possible sequence. A controlled drift toward the sea. A faint hope that a field could be found. A landing attempt that might succeed. Stigler's maneuvering required more than moral courage. It required seamanship of the air. He had to calculate wake turbulence, keep his formation tight enough to deceive flak gunners, and maintain a relative bearing that would not attract attention from friendly fighters. There is a small particular skill to holding formation with a crippled aircraft. You cannot rely on symmetry or constant speed. You have to be patient. You have to read the plane beside you like a partner in a difficult dance. Stigler danced. For those minutes, the war felt suspended. The B-17 and the Bf-109 became two strange companions in a vast sea of gray. They moved as a pair toward the thin line where land meets water, and every second that ticked by was a gift of time that had been purchased at the price of an officer's reputation. If the crossing had any soundtrack, it would be a mixture of distant thunder from flak, the mechanical rasp of propellers, and the quiet small noises that survive even in the belly of a wounded plane. The rustle of fabric, the metallic clank of harnesses, the human breaths between the clamor. Men whispered and prayed in those intervals. They counted and recalculated. They looked up and saw the enemy pilot in his cockpit. What neither pilot could know in that hour was how the moment would ripple. These were not tragic heroes bent on philosophical statements. They were people making decisions that would, decades later, be told and retold because of the lives they spared. They acted, and because they acted, there were families who would exist, grandchildren who would trace their genealogy to a flight that nearly ended in the cold belly of the North Sea. The bomber edged closer to the coast. The land looked thin and hostile. Men on the ground might mistake the formation and open fire. A single cannon burst could finish what mechanical failures had begun. The time came to decide whether to commit to the gamble of landing in England, to try for a field like RAF Seething, or to risk going out over water and ditching. On the other side of the sky, British fighters scoured for survivors. For Stigler, the risk of continuing to escort increased with every mile, because the odds of being seen by his own side did not lessen. At the edge of the continent, as the air grew colder and the coastline sharpened, the issue of secrecy already began to radiate outward. Stigler understood that if he returned to his squadron and reported having spared enemy airmen, the story would not be told as a merciful anecdote. It would be a case of insubordination requiring inquiry. Brown, who would later face his own chain of command, recognized that the U.S. Army Air Forces might also choose to silence the story, for reasons of morale management, intelligence, or simple bureaucratic fear of unusual narratives. But in that sky, such concerns were in the future. Right now the task was more mechanical and immediate. Reach the coast, keep the engines running, hold formation, keep the men breathing. The sky, which had seemed so full of rules and orders, was shaped now by a human choice. Two pilots, on opposite sides of a war, had carved out a space where mercy could take action instead of words. As they neared the coastline, The bomber crew searched for a place to put 4 tons of wounded metal and tired wounded men. Radios clicked with static and urgency. Brown, exhausted and focused, scanned the ground. He knew the local fields in a way that only a combat pilot does, by contour, by hedgerow, by the faint trail of a road. He knew the feel of a landing crash in his bones, and the difference between a field that would swallow a plane and one that would give it a chance. The German fighter held its place as if making a promise. It would not fire. It would not stray. It would keep its wings steady and let the Americans do their work. The gesture had already altered the tenor of a war-torn afternoon into something else, an improvised alliance between the wounded and the resolute. They crossed the last stretch over water, and time, which had been carved into the mission by flak bursts and the sputter of engines, seemed thicker now. Each turn, each adjustment, was an argument for survival. They flew low enough to see the shape of the beach, the small cars sliding along the coast road, the anonymous pattern of cottages. The bomber's skin rattled. Then, just as the coastline seemed near enough to reach, events accelerated. A gust of wind, an engine cough, a misjudged bank. The fragile calculus of damage and skill telescoped into a single, decisive descent. The men prepared for a landing that would not be graceful. They strapped in. They held down one another's hands in the briefest of human contacts. They readied themselves for the trauma of impact. At that moment, the protective shape of the Messerschmitt did something one would scarcely expect in the logic of war. It pressed its wing in a small, impossible salute, and then, as if to ensure no misunderstanding, it guided a path for the bomber as they approached the field that would, for an instant, be their potential salvation. And then, the 2 planes moved together into the final approach. One a wounded giant scraping for life, the other the odd, quiet guardian beside it, and the world narrowed to a line of earth and the will to reach it. They came down like a wounded animal finding a last field to stand on. Charlie Brown's hands were steady, even when his vision had blurred with cold and adrenaline. He set the crippled B-17 onto the sod at RAF seething, with the kind of hard, exacting touch that separates a landed plane from a shattered one. The aircraft hit hard, bounced, ground-looped, and finally surrendered motion. Metal screamed against earth, the tail dug, the nose rose and then collapsed as if trusting the field to relieve it. Men shouted. The smell of hydraulic fluid and burned fabric filled the cabin. When the hatch tore open and the crew spilled out, they were a ragged handful, blood on sleeves, faces gray from oxygen loss, boots crusted with frost. Emergency crews ran from the perimeter. British medics moved with the calm certainty that comes from exposure to sudden ruin. They checked pulses, found broken bones, bundled bodies into stretchers. One man, the tail gunner who had been killed in the first bursts of flak, was carried out with a white sheet over his face. The weight of him was a simple, terrible accounting. 1 life had been taken. 9 were still breathing. For the survivors, the immediate relief was edged with disbelief. They stared at the sky as if it could not be trusted to hold such contradictions, mercy and murder in the same sweep of cloud. They knew, because every bomber crew knew, that the cost of survival was rarely only the moment it happened. There would be questions. There would be forms. There would be orders. Orders came almost at once. Word moved through the RAF control and back to U.S. command. The mission had been lost with heavy damage. 1 crewman dead, 8 wounded, 9 returned. Classify the incident. Brown and his men faced debriefers who were efficient, clinical, often oddly relieved to have a clear list of damage and losses to file away. The bomber, stripped of the myth of heroism, was paperwork. Serial numbers, flak patterns, times, the charred smudges where shrapnel had eaten through aluminum. But some facts could not be reduced to a form. Brown could not be asked in a checklist what it felt like to see a German fighter touch his wing and salute. The only relevant evidence, pilots' recollections, the watchful eyes of men who had been there, moved into the gray zone of memory and the stricter gray of military discretion. The U.S. Army Air Forces, wary of stories that complicated a tidy wartime narrative, instructed silence. The men were told not to speak publicly about the encounter. The event would sit behind classification and the pragmatic reasons that often shape such orders: intelligence, morale, operational secrecy. On the German side, the consequences were less bureaucratic and more perilous. Franz Stigler turned his Messerschmitt back toward his base with a folded thing in his chest that was not pride. He had risked his position, and under the weight of his decision, he felt the small, steady fear of discovery. Luftwaffe regulations, and the political wind of the regime with which it was entwined, would not treat such mercy kindly. Stigler kept his mouth shut. He told few, and those he might have told, if any records exist, were officers who would look at the incident as an error, a lapse, or as dangerous leniency. So the story went underground. It existed as witness statements and as a memory in the heads and hearts of men who had been ordered to bury it. They carried it like a scar. Brown learned to live with the peculiar loneliness of a secret that had saved lives. He could tell no one the full story, because the men he would want to tell were also constrained by duty. Stigler returned to a string of missions in the growing chaos on the German front, and he carried the image of a fallen bomber and the faces inside it like contraband. Both men kept silence for reasons that were practical, fearful, and oddly respectful of the fragile outcome they had helped create. War, after all, does not end neatly at the moment of a landing. For Ye Old Pub's crew, recovery came in fits. British medical units stitched wounds and wrapped frostbite. Men who had been pulled from the aircraft received the care that a wartime base could provide. Bandaging, IVs, blankets. One more dead to bury and the rest to mend. The tail gunner was given a burial with the rituals proper to the military he served. In the weeks that followed, the living men were patched, processed, and either returned to duty or sent home depending on regulations and the severity of their injuries. What the orders could not grasp was the ripple beyond the airfield. Lives that had been teetering on the edge of extinction kept their balance. Letters that would never be written were still possible. Faces on family portraits in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Tennessee would not be blanked by telegrams. The ordinary geometry of human existence, marriages, births, harvests, graduations, continued because someone in a leather jacket in a cold cockpit had decided not to pull a trigger. Decades would pass before that geometry was explained as anything more than private luck. The immediate chapter of the story closed with terse memos and firm directives. Men returned to their units, to further missions, to rotations. They learned not to talk about the unusual pairing that had saved them. Silence in those years was a common currency. It bought men the right to move forward and to be, for the world at large, simply veterans among many. Life after the war followed different trajectories. Brown stayed with flying in some capacity and later built a life that included both service and civilian years. Stigler survived the collapse of the Luftwaffe and, like many former servicemen, made the difficult transition to peace. He emigrated to Canada, where he lived quietly for years, trying to keep the old world from contaminating the new. He did not make his wartime act public. To speak of it was not only to risk personal shame from those who could not understand. It was to reopen a wound in a world that wanted to look forward rather than backward. For nearly half a century, the incident existed in fragments. The men involved aged and made rooms for the event in their private memories. Families noticed silences and odd evasions. Children grew up around questions without answers. The 9 men who had survived became, for lack of a better word, brothers, bound not by blood but by the single-threaded experience of a day when everything could have ended differently. Many years later, when those brothers would meet with each other and with strangers who wanted to know what had happened, they would use that word exactly. Brothers. It was a kinship formed by near loss and by the peculiar gratitude of survivors. The story might have remained in that private orbit if not for the small unraveling that sometimes happens when a man can no longer hold a secret. In 1986, at a public gathering of veterans, an event where men traded missions for memory, Charlie Brown spoke in a way he had not been permitted to speak for decades. He told an audience of pilots and historians about the day over Bremen and of the Messerschmitt that had come alongside. He told them about the salute. It was the kind of admission that opens a search. Brown's disclosure, measured and sober, did what such admissions often do. It created a trail. He began to ask questions in public forums and in veterans' publications. He wrote to groups, to reunions, and to organizations linked to wartime aviation. He asked if any Luftwaffe pilots could recall escorting a crippled B-17 on December 20, 1943. Those appeals, patient and persistent, eventually found a small, surprising channel, an ex-Luftwaffe newsletter, read by men who had once flown under German colors and by historians who preserved scraps of memory. In that newsletter, Brown placed a short, factual statement and a request. He sought the pilot who had spared his plane. The paper published it, and somewhere in the folds of that magazine, an old man read the lines and felt a cold, sudden recognition. The reply that came back was brief according to those who later described it. I was the one. Not a claim to glory, not a plea for absolution, but a crisp admission of presence. The letter in the newsletter triggered a chain that would reach across oceans. They moved cautiously at first. Letters, and then a phone call. Neither side rushed to a claim. They tested facts, dates, squadron numbers. When the verification was sufficient, a phone call connected two men who had shared a sky. The conversation was not a dramatic monologue, but a measured exchange. Two older men compared notes, acknowledged the past, and found, in the silence between verified details, a surprising warmth. The initial contact led to arrangements. A meeting, a handshake, the closing of a 46-year silence. They met in Florida in 1990. When Brown and Stigler saw each other for the first time since that winter afternoon, the moment was plain enough to be almost overwhelming. The two men embraced in a hotel room, the kind of meeting that has been described and redescribed in numerous interviews and articles. Grown military men breaking into tears, hands on shoulders, foreheads touching in a way that expressed regret, relief, and a shared recognition of mortality. The audience that watched the reunion, family members, surviving crew, some journalists, saw something that transmuted the story from military episode into human witness. The embrace was private and public at once, a human reconciliation performed in the eyes of many. For the 9 surviving Americans, the moment had an added weight. They had lived with silence for decades, and for them the meeting confirmed what they had always suspected. Stigler was not a caricature of an enemy. He was a man who had, in a single operative choice, preserved their lives. The men called themselves brothers in the hours that followed, and their families learned the fuller dimensions of what had happened to their fathers and grandfathers. After the reunion, the story grew. The press told versions of the events, historians wrote longer accounts, and a wider public came to know what had been, for years, a private matter. The men who had once been young and consumingly occupied with survival were now old men whose past had become a moral lesson in the present. Their reunion would spark further meetings, ceremonies, interviews, and quiet dinners, where candies of emotion were shared and memories compared. Recognition followed in measured forms that tracked the contours of official history, catching up with human truth. Awards were given to living veterans, the kinds of honors that acknowledge bravery, endurance, and the complicated moral landscape of combat. Some of the ye old pub crew received decorations decades after the fact. Charlie Brown's role in keeping men alive was recognized with high honors. Franz Stigler, too, received a civilian award for his act of conscience, a star of peace that acknowledged the moral courage of an individual in conflict with the expectations of his time. These recognitions did not sanitize history or rewrite the past. Rather, they acted as formal acknowledgments that morality can emerge even where order and discipline demand otherwise. The story caught the imagination of authors and readers. A book, A Higher Call, recounted the episode in a way that reached a broad audience, drawing attention to the small acts that changed the course of many lives. Exhibits at air museums pointed to the event with photographs, artifacts, and testimonies. Restored flying fortresses, beautiful humming urgent machines of a vanished age, carried the tale into air shows and educational programs, teaching new generations about the cost of war and the surprising places where mercy can be found. Children and grandchildren of those men grew to understand that their family histories contained not only documents and war medals, but a moral hinge on which future generations turned. Families told the story at barbecues and in quiet kitchens, and the narrative shaped identities. An ancestor who had been spared, a living relative who had shown the unusual courage to be merciful. The ripple effect was practical as well as symbolic. Lives that might not have been lived were lived fully, and their descendants bore children in the ordinary way of the world. Yet the story's power lay less in awards or publications than in the small shifting ways it reframed the language of enmity. Men who had been enemies had become friends. Their relationship suggested that even within the structures of war, Private codes and human decency can create exceptions. Stigler's act did not redeem the system that produced him, and it did not represent a general case. But it did represent a clear moral choice that had material consequences for 9 men, for their families, and for a public that wanted stories of grace. As the years continued, the veterans grew older. Some of the ye old pub crew died with the knowledge that their emergency had been preserved by an enemy's mercy. Stigler died in Canada, after a life that included the burden and blessing of his private act. Their stories were told and retold at anniversaries and reunions. They were subjects of documentaries and magazine features. Historians argued over the precise details. Relatives compared notes. Communities erected small memorials. The plane itself, ye old pub, became in public imagination less a sheet of metal than a vessel of fate and choice. To put the event in clear terms, one German ace chose not to fire when he might have guaranteed a medal and a tally of kills. He paid the price of silence and the risk of punishment by his own side. 9 American airmen, brothers by experience, lived because of that choice. One man died that day, and his family mourned. The rest returned home and continued lives that would generationally branch into dozens more. What carries from this story is not a simple moral injunction, but the stubborn fact that individual decisions matter. In the machinery of war, which organizes, anonymizes, and orders violence, a single human judgment quietly, but decisively, altered the map of what would happen. The gesture of a salute between enemy cockpits was not theatrical. It was a small, human recognition that reoriented commitments and saved lives. The act was risky, lonely, and costly in ways that might never be fully visible. It was, nonetheless, an act that produced tangible outcomes. The title of this story, The Incredible Story of a German Ace and His 9 American Brothers, frames it as it must be framed. A narrative about a soldier of one nation whose moral choice bound him, across decades and seas, to the men he might have killed. The 9 survivors claimed a kinship that was neither legal nor military but real. They were, in the narrowest and truest sense, brothers, joined by the narrow thread of mercy in a war that otherwise ties men together by uniform and ordinance. There are limits to what such stories can teach. Mercy in one instance does not erase systemic crimes. Acts of conscience do not make ideologies benign. Yet these limits do not diminish the human reality in the center of this event. An individual made a choice that preserved life, and that preservation reshaped families and histories. The ripple effects reached farther than any medal or ceremony could account for. Grandchildren who would be born, weddings that would take place, the ordinary course of civic life that continued because those men did not die. In the end, what remains most striking is not only the image of a Messerschmitt riding a battered bomber across hostile skies, but the quieter moments after. Men sitting in hotel rooms decades later, hands clasped, eyes wet with the knowledge that what they had once done had mattered. History keeps the skeleton of events, dates, places, units, but memory stitches flesh to that frame. It is in those stitched moments that we see the human choices in full color. If you want to learn more, read A Higher Call, or visit an aviation museum where a restored B-17 might remind you of the fragility of machines and of the sturdiness of some human acts. The story of Charlie Brown, Franz Stigler, and the 9 American brothers is not merely about war. It is about the way a single human decision can change the lives of dozens, even centuries later. If this story moved you, consider exploring the book or visiting an exhibit where these planes and their histories are kept alive. Stories like this survive when we keep looking, reading, and remembering.